Hi friends, and welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Emily, and today I'm going to be sharing a whole, I don't know if I can safely pick this up, a whole stack of books that I would highly recommend reading in the springtime. Couple notes here at the beginning. The majority of these books would be classified as children's literature, but that happens to be one of my favorite genres of books to read, and I love all of these very much. The other thing to note is that it has finally stopped raining for a bit today, and so I have the windows open, so you will hear some traffic noise of people driving in front of our apartment building, so fresh air is worth it. But let's go ahead and jump right into these books. I also wanted to say, I noticed as I was getting ready to sit down and talk about these that there's a lot of orphans in these books, which was not intentional, it just kind of happened, but yeah. So the first one I wanted to talk about is Charlotte's Web by E.B. White, and I have this beautiful version that is illustrated by Garth Williams, who is one of my all-time favorite illustrators. And this is a story about a pig, and it's this young runt of the litter pig named Wilbur, who is kind of adopted by Fern, who is the main little girl, and Wilbur was going to be killed because he was really small, and that was a really common practice. Most farmers back at that time, they didn't have the resources, that's the word I was thinking of, the resources to care for animals that were small or weakly or etc. But Fern ends up saving Wilbur's life, and her father allows her to adopt him, so she kind of takes care of him and raises him and bottle feeds him and all of that. And then when he gets old enough, he's put out in the barnyard, and there he meets the other animals that live on the farm. There's geese and sheep and cows, etc. And he finds a special friend who is named Charlotte. And Charlotte is actually a spider who has her web up in the doorway of the barn. And at this point, once Wilbur gets a bit older, he discovers that his destiny in life is basically to be turned into ham and bacon, etc. Which is obviously a traumatizing thing for a young pig to learn. And so basically all the animals, but Charlotte in particular, set out to rescue Wilbur from this fate. So it's a really sweet book. It's got all of the things about springtime where, you know, springy weather and all the baby animals. I did notice when I was trying to gather together books for this particular list that there are so many books that I have read and really enjoyed that are summery. Summertime or autumn or winter. But when I was trying to find books specifically that seemed to say spring to me, it was kind of difficult, honestly. The majority of the books, they might start in the spring, but they go into summertime. So I did my best, but that's book number one. Book number two, I think, is actually probably what I would consider a quintessential spring book, and it is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. And I have this beautiful hardback edition, which is illustrated by Tasha Tudor, another one of my all-time favorite illustrators. And this is a story about a little orphan girl who was raised in a pretty wealthy family. She actually lived in India, where she was kind of waited on hand and foot her entire life until tragedy strikes. I believe it's malaria, and it kills both of her parents. So she is sent back to England to live with her, I'm pretty sure it's her uncle. And she is taken back to his manor house, which is in Yorkshire. And it's this big, gloomy sort of a house. It's on the edge of the moors. Oh, the descriptions of the countryside and of the moor makes me just want to go to England and Scotland and visit the moor so badly. I have read this book so many times, to be honest. Anyway, so she's sent back to this manor house. Her uncle is not there. She's just kind of on her own, and she has to completely relearn how life works And there's this young servant girl, she's a maid at the house, whose name is Martha, who comes from a very large family. And she has many, many siblings that they live with their mother in this cottage on the edge of the moor. And Martha is just a very like honest, hearty sort of a Yorkshire country lass, and she is just astounded at little Mary, which I don't believe I mentioned yet. Mary, who's the main girl's name, who is just completely spoiled. Hold on. Okay, I think we're safe. Anyway, Martha is just astounded at how spoiled and honestly kind of ignorant Mary is on how to do very basic things, such as dressing herself. Mary doesn't know how to do that, and she's shocked that anyone would expect her to dress herself. And Martha, being the honest country girl that she is basically like, I'm not dressing you. You need to figure out how to do that yourself. And she kind of pushes and encourages Mary to go play. Mary's just like, play? What is this? And so Martha honestly feels kind of sorry for this poor, rich little orphan girl that nobody seems to kind of want. And she's kind of contrary and just not a particularly pleasant child to be around. And so she works things out. She gets Mary a skipping rope, and she'll send Mary out into the garden to go skip rope. And so Mary kind of slowly starts learning how to be a normal, ordinary little girl. She discovers the garden and this gruff, cranky old gardener, and she just kind of falls in love with it. There is a legend at this manor house of a secret garden that used to be, I guess it was the mistress, her aunt's favorite garden, and when her aunt died, it was locked up and the key was thrown away. And Mary is just so intrigued by this. And so she goes walking out in the garden one day, and there's a little robin redbreast poking away at the dirt, and Mary happens to see that there's a key. There's a key that is buried in the ground, and so she obviously gets the key, and she's determined to find the secret garden, which obviously she does. That's the title of the book. I'm not going to go any further into detail on it, but it is just such a lovely, perfect spring read, because it's talking all about the crocuses and the different bulbs and flowers that start coming up out of the ground, the early spring flowers, and it's very much like nature-y garden, birds, and she becomes good friends with Martha's younger brother Dickon, and just the Yorkshire accents that are in here, oh, it's so lovely. I highly recommend this book. Like I said, I have read this so many times. And in particular, if you can get an edition that has been illustrated by Tasha Tudor, her illustrations are just amazing. And she's got the little chapter heading illustrations. And I love it. I believe this one I got off of Amazon, but I can't remember if I got it off of Amazon as a used book or off of Abe Books, but oh, I love it so much. So the next book is technically, I guess, I don't know if it would be classified as a young adult or if it would be still considered junior reading. It says junior on it, but it is an older book, and it is Freckles by Jean Stratton Porter. I love every single one of Jean Stratton Porter's books that I've read. She's very nature heavy. She talks about plants and animals, and one of her favorite things to write about was the Limberlost Swamp, and I just love her writing style. It is so good, and her characters are amazing. This book is definitely a little bit shorter, so I think that might be why it's classified as a junior edition. It's a story of an orphan boy who comes along and finds work for a logging crew. I believe they're a logging crew. They're basically these men that are working on cutting down trees in the swamp. And the one thing about it that you kind of forget throughout the book is that he actually only has one hand. We're not really sure, especially at the beginning of the book, what happened. He just has one hand. And so he has a really hard time finding work. But basically the foreman, owner, manager of this logging crew really likes the look of Freckles. He decides to hire him because he just sees that Freckles is a honest, good boy with a lot of character, and is just a good person to have around. And so he gives Freckles the job of guarding the Limberlost, because there's people that are trying to come in and cut down these big, old, beautiful trees that are worth loads of money at this point in time, and they have to protect those trees from these, I guess you could say, the villains of the story, basically, because they're owned by the company. And so they don't want people coming in and stealing these trees that are going to be taken and used for things like furniture, and I guess mostly furniture. And so it's a story about Freckles, and he kind of makes friends, and there's this older couple that he makes friends with, and he meets this beautiful young girl. He calls her Angel. And it's got like a sweet little romance in it, and there's like this mystery of where Freckles came from and how he got where he is. And it's just, yeah, it's such a lovely story. Again, this one kind of, from what I remember, kind of starts in the springtime, or maybe when it's cold, and then it kind of goes into more of a summery weather, but there's loads of descriptions of the swamp and the birds and the little animals, and Freckles is just a very nature-loving boy, and so he loves his job, which is literally to just patrol around this certain portion of the swamp twice a day. He has to go in the morning and in the evening. And he kind of makes friends with some of the little animals out there, and he finds, I believe it's a buzzard, a particular type of buzzard chick in a nest that he'll just go and sit and watch, and it's lovely. Yeah, it's very nature heavy, very animal heavy, which is all things that I love very much. So I definitely recommend this. It's got a little bit of a plot twist in the end. There's a bad guy, and you know, Freckles has to kind of defend his area of the swamp and stick up for his job, and it's just such a good story. Alrighty, another book about a little orphan girl. This is Heidi by, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, Johanna Speary? I'm not sure. This is a lovely little story about a little girl whose parents died from some sort of a sickness, and her aunt doesn't want to take care of her. Her aunt is just kind of like, I have my life, I'm doing my thing, I don't want to be saddled with a little girl, so she takes Heidi up high up in the mountains, through the Alps, and drops her off with her stern, grumpy old grandfather. Now, her grandfather, Heidi's grandfather, I think from what I remember, it's been a little bit since I've read this book, he'd kind of disowned his daughter, Heidi's mother, because of who she married, and so he kind of retreated up to the mountaintops, and he has this beautiful cottage. The descriptions of the little cottage and the furniture and stuff in it are just lovely. But he has this beautiful cottage up in the mountains, and he just lives there, and he's kind of this angry, grumpy hermit of a man. And then Heidi is kind of dumped on him, and she is just so excited to have like her own little room and her own little bed and all the little details. She loves her grandfather's cottage, she loves being up in the mountains, and she loves the way the wind comes sweeping down and blows through this line of pine trees and the musical sound that it makes. She just loves everything about it. And so she doesn't even really notice that her grandfather's not particularly cheerful. She just kind of carries on in her own merry little way. She makes friends with Peter the goat herd, who Peter's very hesitant about her at first until she shares her very generous food portions with him, because Peter comes from a pretty poor family. And then Heidi goes and meets Peter's grandmother, and it's this really sweet, lovely bit where it kind of shows the grandfather basically falling in love with his little granddaughter. And then the aunt comes back and tells the grandfather and Heidi that she has this marvelous opportunity where Heidi can go and be the companion to the little girl, Clara, who is the little girl in the family that Heidi's aunt works for. And it's a very wealthy family. And Heidi, of course, doesn't want to go. And the grandfather's just like, what are you talking about? You dumped her on me, basically. You can't just come back and take her. But then her aunt just kind of works it out, and I can't remember exactly if she kind of sneaks around behind the grandfather or if she finally guilts the grandfather into sending Heidi away. So then Heidi travels to the city where she is the companion for little Clara, who is a poor little girl who is stuck in a wheelchair. She can't walk. And they just think Heidi is so quaint and funny because she has her little country girl sort of ways. And poor Heidi is just so sad. She absolutely does not want to be in the city. She wants to go back home to her grandfather, and she tries to run away, at least at one point, and she's just so miserable and so unhappy that they finally agree to send her back home. And so then she's able to finally go back home to her grandfather. And then there's a bit more of the story after that. I'm not going to tell you everything. But again, it has just beautiful descriptions of the Alps, the mountains, and like I said, her grandfather's cottage, dream house goals. And it's just a lovely springy, I think it kind of starts when it's maybe beginning of spring, and it talks about kind of winter time and then spring again. I love it a lot. And I'm also particularly sentimental to this particular book because my younger sister was named after Heidi. And this particular edition of the book has some really pretty illustrations in it. It's a vintage book that I bought used. But anyway, I need to talk through these a little bit faster. The next book I wanted to talk about is The Witch of Blackbird Pond by Elizabeth George Spear. And this is one of my all-time favorite authors, all-time favorite books. I just love this book so much. Again, this is about an orphan girl, but this time she's quite a bit older. She's a teenager. And her name is Kit. And she has grown up in Barbados with her grandfather. And then I believe, her parents may have died when she was younger or something. Then her grandfather ends up dying. So she travels across the ocean to one of the early settlements in America. I believe it's in Massachusetts? Connecticut, to go and stay with her aunt and uncle and her two cousins. But they don't know that she's coming because at that time mail is very inconsistent, and Kit basically had to kind of flee where she was living because her grandfather had some debts and whatnot, and so she was able to pay them off, but it kind of left her in a difficult situation. So she just immediately traveled to Connecticut to stay with her aunt and uncle, and she gets there and it's this very strict, sort of stern, early Puritan colony. And for Kit, who is just kind of grown up running around on Barbados, and it's beautiful and warm all the time, and she just lived a very, very different life with her grandfather. And so then when she comes to Connecticut, she finds it very difficult to adjust, where they're all just so stern, and they don't seem to know how to have fun and laugh and enjoy life or anything like that. And one of the first things that happens is while she's still on the ship coming over, she's almost to the village where she's going, I guess it's a village or town where she's going to be staying. There's this little girl that's also on the boat with her, and the little girl's doll falls in the water, and so Kit jumps into the water and goes swimming over to it and to rescue the doll. What she doesn't realize is that at that time period and in that area, it was very uncommon for people to know how to swim. Like, even sailors didn't always know how to swim, which is bonkers. And so the ones that could swim were kind of considered to be witches. And so she kind of starts off on just the wrong foot all the way. But anyway, she gets to the village and she's staying there with her aunt and uncle and her two cousins, Mercy and Juliet, I believe is what it is. And she just has, like I said, a really difficult time adjusting to life there, but she finally is able to some degree. And she sort of finds her place within this community, but then she makes friends with this lady who lives out on the edge of the swamp named Hannah, who's a Quaker. And at that time period, Quakers were kind of considered heretics and terrible, and they were just treated so poorly. And so poor little old Hannah is living on the edge of this swamp in a little cottage all by herself, and Kit sort of makes friends with her because she's a fellow outsider. And yeah, it's I don't want to go into too much more detail because I don't want to give it away, because it's a lovely book. There's a sweet little romance in it, and it's really, really interesting just reading about the lifestyle and the struggles that people went through in that time period with getting sick, and the very limited resources that they had, and that they had to provide pretty much everything for themselves. They had to make everything. And it's really interesting. I love Kit as a character. She's just so, I don't know, she seems so wild and flamboyant against this background of this gray, sad, sort of depressed, strict colony. And it's lovely. There's, I believe it starts when it's kind of cold, and then it kind of goes into more springtime. Kind of goes throughout a couple of years. But yeah, I love it. It just kind of makes me think of springtime, because I think that it's right around then when she comes to Connecticut. Alright, the next book is a more recent favorite of mine. I hadn't actually read it through myself until maybe a couple of years ago, and it is The Wind and the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. And this gorgeous edition is illustrated by Robert Ingpen. This is actually Micah's copy of it, with just these amazing, amazing illustrations throughout. Like, I love it so much. And this is a story about animals, and it starts off in the springtime with, there we go, there's another illustration. I must behave myself and not go through and show you all the gorgeous illustrations. It starts off in springtime with Mole, and Mole is sort of spring cleaning his house when he suddenly just hears this irresistible call. He just can't stay in his house anymore, and he gets out of his burrow and goes racing across the fields, and he just feels that itch of spring fever. And then he meets up with Ratty, or Rat, who's a water rat. He ends up staying with Rat for a while, because Rat lives along the river, and Mole just thinks it's such an adventure to live along the river. And he starts meeting some of Rat's other friends, like Badger, and then there's Toad, who's just this wild, rascally sort of a character who's kind of wealthy, lives in sort of a manor, and likes to buy all the latest gadgets and things. And he is obsessed with a new scheme every sort of day. He comes up with something else that's literally the best thing ever. And then he discovers motor cars. And Toad is a terrible driver, and he gets in all sorts of accidents, so he's kind of banned from driving, and his friends all try to help him not think about cars, and then he kind of gets obsessed with it, and he steals a car and gets put in prison and all this stuff. And it's kind of funny because it's a mix of animals and humans, but it's just such a lovely, lovely story. And like I said, it starts off in springtime when all the animals are cleaning and preparing and getting everything ready for warmer weather. And then descriptions of the countryside and nature, and it's just such a sweet story. Like I said, I didn't read it until more recently. I definitely heard of it growing up, but I didn't really read it until after I met Micah and we were dating, and he let me borrow this. And not gonna lie, I think that the illustrations really help make the book. This is just such a particularly, like, each of the chapters has like this double page, beautiful illustration. And this was my first introduction to Robert Ingpen as well. He also has illustrated a number of other children's books, but I think this one is my particular favorite. Yeah, I don't know if I've necessarily described that particularly well, but I really recommend it. It's all about animals and nature, so. Alright, and then we are down to the last two. This one I kind of added in last minute because I just got it from the library because I was thinking about it the other day and I wanted to reread it. And it's called Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nem. And it's the story of little Mrs. Frisby, who's a little mouse who lives in a cinder block on the edge of, or in a field on a farm. And she lives there with her 3 little children. Her husband died sometime before the beginning of the book. And it is springtime at the beginning of the book, and they are preparing for their big annual move. They move out of the fields and away from the plows and such that would damage their homes and potentially kill them, to the riverside. But then, right when she's about to move and get everything going, her little son Timothy gets sick. And he's very terribly sick, and he couldn't possibly be moved. And so she's in this quandary because she doesn't know what to do, because she needs to move her family to keep him safe, but she can't move her family because her little son is sick, and so she doesn't know what to do. So she ends up, I believe what it is she goes and finds an owl in the forest and asks him for advice, and he tells her to talk with the rats who live in the rose bush. So she goes to talk to these rats that live in the rose bush, and she discovers all sorts of secrets and crazy things about these rats, and she learns that like her husband worked with them and whatnot. And it's just, it's such a fascinating and interesting little story. And I really enjoy it, because basically she goes to the rats and they end up being able to help her out of her quandary, but there's like this whole story of like labs and escaping, and the animals like know how to read and stuff, and it's just, it's a really, really enjoyable book. And I was telling my husband about it because I was asking him if he'd read it, and he said he hadn't, and so I was describing it to him, and it reminded me that it existed as a book, and I really want to reread it, so that's why I got it. Alright, and then last but absolutely not least, this wouldn't be a proper book recommendation list if I didn't mention a Redwall book somewhere in here. So I've saved my favorite for last, and the last book I'm going to recommend today is Mossflower by Brian Jacques. And this is one of the books in the Redwall series. It was the second book that Brian Jacques wrote, but it's actually a prequel to the Redwall book. And this is a story about Martin the Warrior and kind of how he came to the Mossflower country and helped all of the mice and other animals there to defeat this evil wildcat, and then after that to build Redwall Abbey. It is, oh, how do I even do it justice to describe it? I love the Redwall series, and I would highly recommend that you read all of them, but for particular in spring reference, this is the one I picked. It starts off in the wintertime when Martin is coming to, he's traveling from where he's been living, and he's walking into the Mossflower country. And what he doesn't realize is that in this particular area of Mossflower, all of the woodland animals have been basically put underneath of this terrible tyrannical rule of Lord Verdaga Green Eyes and his daughter Zarmina. Now, Lord Verdaga is quite sick, and so his daughter, Zarmina, has kind of taken over control of a lot of things, and they've basically taken the woodland creatures in the forest as slaves and made them work farms and whatnot to provide for Lord Verdaga and all of his army of ferrets, rats, stoats, etc. And so Martin is walking through the woods. He has an old sword, his father's old sword, with him, and he's captured by some of the soldiers, Lord Verdaga's soldiers, and he's dragged into the castle, and he ends up being sentenced to be put into prison for a period of time because it's one of the laws of this land that he's not allowed to carry weapons, which Martin obviously didn't know. He's never been here before. And so he kind of gets stuck in prison over winter until springtime. And then he ends up being able to escape from prison. He meets some friends, woodland animals and such, and one of my all-time favorite Redwall series characters, Gomp the Mouse Thief. And there's Bella of Brock Hall, and Goody and Ben Stickle, and oh, I don't know if there's anything else that I can say about it without completely spoiling it. But it's this whole adventure story where Martin ends up having to go off adventuring to try and find Bella of Brock Hall, who is a badger, find her father to come back and rescue the woodland animals from Zarmina, who is now queen of Mossflower because her father died through suspicious circumstances. And so it's this whole adventure where he has to go off and go on this really long quest, and he goes with Bump the Mouse Thief and his good friend Denny the Mole. And he has all sorts of adventures and whatnot along the way, and I just love this book so much. It's all about animals and nature, and the entire series is phenomenal, but this particular book for springtime, this is a good one. And that's all that I have for you today. I hope that you enjoyed listening to me blather on about these books. They're all books that I have read and loved many, many times, and I can highly recommend them to any of you. Thank you for hanging out with me today. I hope that you enjoy these books if you end up picking up some of them to read. If you have any springtime sort of books that you would highly recommend, please do leave them in the comments down below. I would love to hear about it. I'm always on the lookout for more wholesome, sweet, amazing nature, animal, springy, or all season types of books. So please, if you have any recommendations, definitely leave them down below. And again, yeah, thank you for watching my video, and I will see you very soon on the next one. Bye!